There's a stretch of land along the Red Sea coast. It looks desolate and strangely quiet. The heat from the sun here can be dangerous, often reaching temperatures as high as 40 to 50 degrees Celsius, particularly in the coastal and lowland regions. Most people couldn't point this place out on a map, and honestly, I couldn't either, not at first. But then, I started pulling a thread, and that thread unraveled one of the most dramatic stories I've ever come across. The story of Eritrea. However, this isn't just about war or politics. It is a story of betrayal, sacrifice, a decades-long struggle, and something more.
A bloody conflict erupted here a few years ago, and there are fears it could erupt again.
When I first started learning about Eritrea, I thought I'd be telling a typical post-colonial story. You know, oppression, liberation, maybe some fragile democracy thrown in. But Eritrea doesn't fit into neat boxes. The deeper I went, the stranger and darker it got. First colonized by Italy, then controlled by Britain, then handed over to Ethiopia under the United Nations. And each time, they were promised autonomy, only to be betrayed. And when they finally fought back, it wasn't for a few years, it was for 30 years of blood, bullets, and a dream that never died. And here's where it gets even darker. They won. Against all odds, they actually won. Eritrea became a new nation, forged through sacrifice and unity. It was supposed to be the happy ending, but it wasn't. Because what followed next wasn't the democracy the people had hoped for. They didn't even get the peace they fought for. And by the time I reached the present, that story of freedom I thought I was looking at had vanished. I was now staring at a liberation movement that has somehow morphed into captivity, and I couldn't help but wonder, what happens when the victory you die for becomes the foundation for the prison you now have to live in? How can a country win the longest liberation war in Africa and still not be free? That is the story I want to share with you today. The story of how Eritrea became broken and what this means for its many refugees scattered across the world. To understand the story of Eritrea, I had to go back to where it started, back to 1889, the year Italy planted its flag on the Eritrean coast and called it theirs. You see, in the late 19th century, European colonial ambitions reached the shores of the Red Sea. Italy, eager to expand its empire during the scramble for Africa, set its sights on this region that would become Eritrea. In 1885, Italian troops landed at the coastal cities of Massawa and Assab, gradually pushing inland. By 1889, seeing what was happening, Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia made a move to protect his own empire from the Europeans. So he signed the Treaty of Wuchale, ceding the region north of the Mereb River to Italy in exchange for military aid. On January 1st, 1890, Italy officially proclaimed the colony of Eritrea. This marked the start of a new era under foreign rule. However, the Italians didn't make this seem like an invasion. Under Italian colonization, Eritrea experienced rapid changes. They called it modernization, civilization even, but in reality, this was the beginning of a long con. In the months that followed, thousands of Italians settled in the new colony, bringing with them modern skills, architecture, and infrastructure. This city called Asmara, the highland capital, became their showroom. They constructed wide streets, Art Deco buildings, and European cafes. They called it Piccola Roma, meaning Little Rome, and from a distance, it seemed like it. Asmara became one of the most modern cities in Africa. There were Italian engineers working night and day to build railways down to the Red Sea, connecting the cool highlands to the sweltering port of Massawa. They brought electricity, factories, schools, hospitals. For the first time, an urban Eritrean working class emerged as many local people moved to the cities for new jobs. Yet, this development came at a price. The people would soon realize that this new modernity wasn't for Eritreans. Education for Eritreans was minimal. Only a few primary schools existed, and colonial policies kept most locals as laborers or soldiers. Fertile lands were appropriated for Italian settlers and plantations, leaving Eritrean farmers with shortages of land. Also, while Italian settlers launched in cafes, Eritreans were barred from entering the same buildings they helped construct. For over 50 years, Italian rule left a mixed legacy. It built modern cities and infrastructure, but also entrenched inequality and exploitation. Eritreans became second-class citizens in their own land, with limited freedoms and opportunities. And as Mussolini's fascist ambitions grew in the 1930s, Eritrea became a launch pad for war. Soon, Italian troops, including thousands of conscripted Eritreans, marched into Ethiopia in a brutal invasion that began in 1935. Conscripted Eritreans were forced to fight their own neighbors. By the time World War II broke out, Eritrea wasn't just a colony anymore. It became a military asset. Italy's African empire was crumbling, but they clung onto Eritrea like a dying dream. And in 1941, that dream shattered. The British arrived, but not as liberators. When the Commonwealth forces swept through the Horn of Africa like a desert storm, the Italian dream crumbled in a matter of months, leaving behind a people caught between two worlds, too modernized to return to their past and too colonized to chart their own future. When I started breaking down world events, I felt overwhelmed by the sheer amount of research and time required to create content in a way that truly added value. But if you want to start out today and focus on what really matters to you, which is your research, you can check out this AI tool, InVideo. This tool will help you create content in the most seamless, intuitive way possible, irrespective of whatever skill level you're at. All you have to do is type in your idea in the prompt box and watch it come to life as a full-length video.
When South Sudan gained independence in 2011, there was so much hope. But just 2 years later, boom, civil.
And the best part of that, you can edit it effortlessly using simple edit commands. Want to add your voice and start with a trivia? Just type it in. This is pretty game-changing. Unlike traditional video tools that come with steep learning curves and only solve bits of the process, InVideo AI is your all-in-one creative partner. It removes the friction, puts you in the director's seat, and lets you focus entirely on your vision while it takes care of the heavy lifting. You can try InVideo AI for free today. This will save you hundreds of dollars that you would otherwise spend on editing, animating, and other production costs. Click on this link in the description box and try it out today.
After several miles, we came across an Italian emissary who had come forward to arrange a talk about the surrender of the capital.
Britain's victory over Italy brought Eritrea under British military administration in 1941. But their march into Eritrea, waving the Union Jack and claiming victory over fascism, merely marked the arrival of a new landlord with a different accent. They were never really interested in the colony, partly because Eritrea was broke, war-ravaged, and complicated. So the British treated it like a salvage yard. They stripped the country of its industrial equipment, dismantled entire factories, and shipped the parts off to other colonies like India, Kenya, and Sudan. They even tore up sections of Eritrea's prized railway and sold them as scrap metal. Yeah, all this happened. Eritreans watched helplessly as their country was being unbuilt piece by piece. During this period, a vibrant political scene developed as Eritreans debated their destiny. Some, remembering cultural and religious ties to Ethiopia's highlands, formed the Unionist Party, advocating unification with Ethiopia. This movement was encouraged and financed by Emperor Haile Selassie's government in Addis Ababa, which coveted Eritrea's Red Sea ports and claimed historical ownership of the land. Meanwhile, many other Eritreans, particularly Muslims, who feared domination in a Christian-led Ethiopia, demanded full independence. They saw Libya and Somalia heading toward independence, and they thought, why not Eritrea? A few of them organized under the Muslim League, later expanding into broader independence groups to press their case. The British, for their own part, treated Eritrea as a protectorate, awaiting a final disposition by international agreement. The challenge was, Eritrea wasn't viewed as a country that would be granted its freedom just because it asked. It was a prize, a gateway to the Red Sea, and the world powers, fresh off World War II, were already playing a new game, and Eritrea was somehow caught in the middle.
Thousands of German workers riot in the streets of East Berlin, burning Soviet flags and buildings in defiance of their red overlords.
You see, In the late 1940s, as the Cold War cast its shadow across the globe, Eritrea was becoming important on the chessboard. Inside the United Nations building in New York City, the world ruling body was faced with its first real test: what to do with this orphaned territory. Four powers were already cycling, each pushing their own agendas, what they considered to be their solutions for Eritrea's future. Britain wanted to split Eritrea, give the Muslim West to Sudan and the Christian highlands to Ethiopia. The Soviet Union backed Ethiopian annexation. France vaguely supported independence, but they didn't push hard. And the United States, well, at first they backed self-determination, but soon they changed their mind. You see, the US had its eyes on a strategic gold mine, the Asmara's Kagnew station, a military base that could intercept radio signals across Africa, the Middle East, even the Soviet Union. To get that base, they needed Ethiopia on their side, and to keep Ethiopia happy, they had to sacrifice Eritrea. This is the game the US is used to playing. Now, with all of those proposals on the table, a UN commission was dispatched to tour Eritrea for the sole purpose of gauging public opinion. However, when they arrived, they were stunned to find a polarized society, roughly divided between pro-Ethiopian unionists and pro-independence activists, all with little common ground. With all of this taken into account, the UN arrived at a compromise wrapped in betrayal, which is known as the 1950 UN Resolution 390A. It said Eritrea would be federated with Ethiopia, semi-autonomous, a local parliament, its own flag, its own languages, but still under the Ethiopian crown. In summary, Eritrea would neither be fully independent nor simply handed to Ethiopia. This became an arranged marriage that looked diplomatic but was built to fail. And then in 1952, that plan went live. Eritrea lowered the British flag and raised the Ethiopian one. A new chapter had begun. But the ink was poisoned. Because Emperor Haile Selassie wasn't here to share power, he wanted it all for himself. This laid the foundation for the troubles ahead. At first, the federation arrangement gave Eritreans a semblance of the freedom they had long sought. On paper, Eritrea was still alive. It had its own parliament, its own flag. Arabic and Tigrinya were official languages reflecting the major cultures of the territory. It even had a constitution. For a brief moment, it seemed Eritrea might enjoy genuine autonomy in union with its larger neighbor. However, Emperor Haile Selassie and his imperial government had other ideas. Unwilling to tolerate anything less than full control, the emperor quickly set about dismantling Eritrea's autonomy. First, the delicate ethnic-religious balance enshrined in Eritrea's constitution was upset by interference from the Ethiopian authorities. Then came the political pressure. Ethiopian advisors began showing up in Eritrean ministries. Pro-union politicians were quietly installed in key positions. One by one, Eritrea's own leaders were forced out, exiled or bought off, and those who spoke out were silenced. In 1955, political parties were banned. In 1958, trade unions were dissolved. By 1960, even Arabic, the very language spoken by nearly half the population, was stripped from official use. The federation became a shell, a stage play, and everyone knew how the final act would end. That act came in November 1962. While surrounded by Ethiopian soldiers and pressured from every direction, the Eritrean Assembly, once the symbol of their autonomy, voted to dissolve itself. Just like that, without a single gunfire, Eritrea lost its short-lived semi-autonomy. Emperor Haile Selassie triumphantly pronounced Eritrea a province of Ethiopia. The flag came down. The name Eritrean government was replaced with Eritrean administration. The dream of self-rule, promised by the UN, sold by diplomats and believed in by millions, was gone. But something else was growing in this place. In the deserts, in the highlands, in the refugee camps across the border in Sudan, a fire was starting. Quiet at first, but steady. And in the western lowlands, near the town of Agodat, a man named Hamid Idris Awate was polishing his rifle. Because when politics fails, only one path remains. September 1st, 1961. It didn't start with a bang. Not really. Just a dusty ambush in the western lowlands. A few men, barely a dozen, opened fire on an Ethiopian police convoy near Mount Ada. The leader was Hamid Idris Awate, a former soldier, tough, charismatic, and fed up with a decade of broken promises. That ambush he led was the beginning of a war that would last for 30 years. At the time, nobody thought much of it. The Ethiopian government called them bandits, a minor nuisance, a flicker of unrest in a forgotten province. But this wasn't a flicker, it was a fuse. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, Awate's 13 fighters held their own against Ethiopian forces for several hours in that first battle. Though Awate himself would die in 1962, less than a year into the struggle, he had inspired something in the people. By the mid-1960s, the rebellion had grown into something called the Eritrean Liberation Front, the ELF, operating from bases in the western lowlands and across the Sudanese border. They had no tanks, no air force, no international support, just rifles, grit, and an unshakable belief that Eritrea deserved to be free. The ELF started small hit-and-run attacks, sabotage, ambushes, but their numbers continued to grow, especially among Eritrean Muslims who felt the weight of both political and cultural suppression. By the late 1960s, something strange began to happen. You see, Eritreans who had once tried to work within the system, that is students, teachers, even government workers, began abandoning their posts and heading for the mountains. They were done asking for justice. They were now going to fight for it. But as the movement grew, so did the tensions inside it. Religious divides, regional rivalries, strategic disagreements. The ELF began splintering, and in 1970, from one of those fractures, a new group emerged, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, the EPLF. Led by young radicals like Isaias Afwerki and Ramadan Noor, the EPLF was sharper, more disciplined, less ideological, and more inclusive. Christians and Muslims, men and women, highlanders and lowlanders. They didn't just want independence. They wanted to build a new kind of Eritrea. They operated from the shadows, literally. Deep in the Sahel mountains, the EPLF carved out an underground world. Hospitals, schools, radio stations, even workshops that built their own weapons. A parallel state beneath the soil. And the Ethiopians, well, they responded with brute force. Air raids, torture, massacres, whole villages burned to the ground. But it only made the rebels stronger. Every bomb dropped created more recruits. Every act of repression tightened the resistance. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Eritrea became the theater of one of Africa's longest and most brutal wars. What started as a small guerrilla insurgency swelled into full-scale revolutionary war for self-determination. But just as the rebels were gaining ground, a new twist came from the very heart of Ethiopia. The empire itself was about to fall. In 1974, Ethiopia's imperial clock finally stopped ticking. Emperor Haile Selassie, the same man who crushed Eritrea's autonomy, was overthrown by a group of military officers calling themselves the Derg. They marched him out of his palace, locked him in a basement, and declared a Marxist revolution. Taking advantage of this chaos, Eritrean rebels, both the ELF and the newer EPLF, suddenly found themselves controlling most of Eritrea's countryside. By 1977, EPLF fighters were at the outskirts of major towns, seemingly on the verge of victory. For a moment, Eritreans allowed themselves to dream. Maybe, just maybe, this new regime would grant them the freedom the old one refused. But that hope didn't last long. Fate intervened. The Derg regime, led by this guy, Colonel Mengistu Haile Mariam, received massive backing from the Soviet Union and its allies, turning the tide of the war. In 1978, with Soviet advisors, tanks and jets, the Ethiopian army launched ferocious offensive and recaptured much of Eritrea. What followed was more than a decade of grueling warfare on a scale unprecedented in sub-Saharan Africa. Ethiopia's generals threw tens of thousands of troops into battle, using napalm and cluster bombs, while the Eritrean guerrillas dug into mountain strongholds and perfected hit-and-run tactics. The human cost was enormous. Both sides suffered heavy casualties. Villages were bombed to rubble, and countless civilians were displaced or killed. Ethiopian forces carried out brutal reprisals, and their indiscriminate oppression only drove more young Eritreans to join the rebel ranks. Amid this all-out war, the Eritrean liberation movement underwent a final transformation. The EPLF emerged as the dominant rebel force after bitter infighting. By 1981, it had effectively sidelined and absorbed the ELF, uniting Eritrean fighters under one front. Women fighters rose to the rank of commanders, and the front ran underground schools and hospitals in liberated areas. Their slogan was simple: victory to the masses. Despite the terror from above, Eritrean guerrillas held out year after year, digging vast networks of trenches and tunnels in the mountains to survive air raids. They learned to repair or even manufacture their own weapons and to treat their wounded with scant resources. The society in liberated zones became highly mobilized for the war effort, forging an extraordinary sense of national unity and purpose. Meanwhile, the Ethiopian forces continued with its assault. With Soviet weapons, Cuban advisors, and billions in aid, the DEG launched massive offensives to crush the EPLF. One of the bloodiest was the Red Star campaign in 1982. Over 120,000 Ethiopian troops stormed the Sahel region with tanks, jets, and napalm. Well, they failed. Eritrean fighters used the mountains as shields and trenches like veins. Women carried ammunition on their backs, sometimes with babies strapped to their chest. Injured fighters crawled back into combat. Medical staff operated in caves, and through all of it, the spirit of resistance never broke. Then, something remarkable happened in the late 80s. The tide began to turn yet again. Cracks began to appear in Ethiopia's armor. You see, the Soviet Union, drowning in its own collapse, started pulling support from Ethiopia. The DEG grew weaker. This emboldened the Eritrean forces. In 1988, the EPLF launched the Battle of Alphabet, one of the most decisive engagements of the war. They annihilated 3 entire Ethiopian divisions and captured stockpiles of weapons, tanks, artillery, even radar systems. The battlefield looked less like a victory and more like a museum of Soviet failure. From there, it was a steady march southward toward Asmara. Meanwhile, Ethiopia faced additional rebellions, notably from the Tigray People's Liberation Front (TPLF) in the province just south of Eritrea. The EPLF forged an informal alliance with the TPLF since both were fighting a common enemy. And then, in 1991, it happened. In a dramatic sequence of events in 1991, the House of Cards in Addis Ababa collapsed. The final rebel offensive by the TPLF-led coalition swept into Ethiopia's capital, and Mengistu fled into exile. On May 24, 1991, after 30 years of armed struggle, Eritrean fighters rolled into Asmara, not as rebels this time, but as victors. Eritrea was finally free. The birth of Eritrea was greeted with celebration and sky-high hopes. In the streets of Asmara and Massawa, people danced, sang patriotic songs, and embraced former guerrilla fighters now hailed as national heroes. But this wasn't the end. It was the start of something harder. After 30 years of war, Eritrea was now independent, but not yet recognized internationally. So, in 1993, they held a referendum. Refugees returned from Sudan. Former guerrillas queued up at ballot boxes next to priests and farmers. When the results came in, they were thunderous. 99.83% of Eritreans voted for independence. Almost unanimous. Not because they were told to, but because they had earned it. Every bullet, every trench, every funeral had led to this moment. On May 24, 1993, Eritrea officially became the world's newest nation. President Isaias Afwerki, commander of the EPLF, was now head of state, and people believed in him. He had lived in the trenches. He had led from the front. He promised a new kind of Africa. No corruption, no aid dependency, no tribal politics. Eritrea would be the Singapore of the Horn. And for a moment, it looked possible. The economy picked up, fueled by reconstruction efforts and diaspora investment. Roads were repaired, Massawa's war-ravaged port was rebuilt, schools reopened, healthcare expanded, exiles returned with fresh ideas and capital. The world applauded this. Even the US opened an embassy in Asmara. Relations with Ethiopia were friendly. The two countries had just overthrown a common enemy. Eritrea even used Ethiopia's currency for a while. Trade flowed freely, borders remained open. On the political front, however, the picture was somewhat complex. President Isaias promised democracy and said all the right things about human rights and the rule of law. Behind the scenes, a new constitution was drafted. It promised free and fair elections, civil liberties, and a free press. Isaias Afwerki endorsed it, at least publicly. He spoke of safeguarding our independence by building a just society. But there were cracks, small but visible. There were no political parties, only the ruling People's Front for Democracy and Justice, PFDJ, a rebrand of the EPLF. The promised elections were repeatedly postponed. Many Eritreans were willing to be patient, given the extraordinary challenges of building a nation from scratch. They trusted President Isaias and his comrades, who were seen as incorruptible freedom fighters. Because this was still the honeymoon. The trauma of the past hasn't faded yet, and the unity forged in war was strong. No one wanted to fracture it. But beneath this optimism, a dangerous question lingered. What happens when a revolutionary movement becomes a government and starts seeing criticism not as feedback, but as betrayal? That question would explode into something unexpected, because by 1998, everything was about to fall apart again. It started with a map. Yeah, this one. A dusty, decades-old map from the colonial era that didn't quite match the reality on the ground. One side said this patch of land belonged to them. The other said no, it's ours. The place was called Badme, a tiny border town, barely a speck in the desert. No oil, no resources, just a name and a line drawn long time ago. But in May 1998, that line became a fuse. Trouble soon broke out. Eritrean and Ethiopian patrols exchanged fire. A few soldiers were killed. Tensions escalated from here, and suddenly these two countries that had just fought side by side turned their guns on each other. It didn't feel real at first. These were brothers, former comrades in arms. Eritrean fighters had marched into Addis with the Tigray-led Ethiopian rebels just 7 years earlier. Now they were digging trenches and planting landmines against each other. The war that followed was as senseless as it was brutal. Ethiopia launched massive human wave assaults. Eritrea responded with coordinated defenses. Tens of thousands of soldiers died in just months. Satellite images showed trench networks that stretched for miles, resembling World War I battlefields. The loss of life was staggering. An estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people on both sides. But for Eritreans, the betrayal cut even deeper. Many still had family in Ethiopia. Cross-border marriages, shared languages, a shared victory in 1991, and now they were sending their sons to kill each other over a town most had never heard of. Inside Eritrea, the government snapped into wartime mode. National service was extended. Civilian institutions were hollowed out. Every resource was funneled into survival, and any dissent, any suggestion that maybe this war wasn't worth it was seen as treason. By the year 2000, the conflict had reached a stalemate. Neither side could claim victory. International pressure mounted. A ceasefire was brokered, and in December, the Algiers Agreement was signed. An independent boundary commission was established. 2 years later, it ruled that Badme, yes, this same dusty, insignificant town that started all of this, belonged to Eritrea. But Ethiopia refused to withdraw. They said the ruling was flawed, and so the war technically ended, but the conflict didn't. A tense standoff began. The border froze. Troops stared at each other from opposite hills. No war, no peace became Eritrea's new reality. And here's the part that changed everything. That unresolved war, the bitterness, the betrayal, the sense of isolation, it became the foundation for something much darker. Because after 2001, Eritrea stopped pretending to be a young democracy in the making. It became a self-isolated fortress, more like the North Korea of Africa. It didn't happen overnight. There was no single speech, no declaration of emergency, just a slow, deliberate tightening of the screws. It started in September 2001, while the world's attention was on smoke rising from Manhattan. In Eritrea, something quieter was unfolding. A group of high-ranking government officials, some of them war heroes, some founding fathers of the country, they published an open letter. They called themselves the G15, and they were asking a simple question: where is the democracy we were promised? Within days, they were gone. Arrested in the middle of the night. No trial, no charges, just vanished. At the same time, every independent newspaper in Eritrea was shut down. Journalists were arrested. Editorial offices raided. Radio stations were replaced with government broadcasts. And just like that, the windows slammed shut. Eritrea went from promising democracy to full-blown authoritarianism. The constitution, ratified in 1997, was shelved. Elections were postponed indefinitely. And the ruling party, that is the PFDJ, became the only legal political force in the country. The justification given by President Isaias for this authoritarian turn was, quote, national security. Young Eritreans were conscripted not just into the army, but into mines, state farms, construction projects. Some were sent to teach in remote villages. Others dug roads. Others just disappeared. There was no way out, no age cap, no real pay, no end in sight. And those who tried to flee, some of them were shot at the border. If they made it across, their families back home were fined or imprisoned indefinitely. Soon enough, this indefinite conscription had effectively become a way of life. By the mid-2000s, a quiet exodus had begun. Then it became a flood. Eritreans risked everything, crossing deserts, dodging traffickers, boarding flimsy boats in the Mediterranean. Many died trying. Others ended up in refugee camps in Sudan, Ethiopia, Israel, and in some parts of Europe. By 2015, Eritrea had become one of the top sources of refugees in the world. And back home, the country grew colder. Religious groups were cracked down on. Private business was strangled. Internet access was limited to slow, state-run cafes. The phone system barely functioned. Foreign journalists were banned. International NGOs were expelled. In 2009, the UN imposed sanctions on Eritrea, accusing it of supporting armed groups in Somalia. The government, of course, denied this, but their response wasn't to open up. It was to dig deeper into isolation. And through it all, Isaias Afwerki stayed silent. He rarely gave interviews. He didn't appoint a successor. He didn't care about foreign pressure. He believed the world had betrayed Eritrea, and now Eritrea would survive on its own. The government maintained strict control over daily life. Citizens needed permits to travel internally. Private entrepreneurs faced heavy restrictions, and all media was state-run. But how did Eritrea, the country that fought the longest war for freedom in Africa, now bow to one of the most repressive governments on the continent? A 2016 UN human rights inquiry even accused the regime of crimes against humanity, including systemic enslavement, torture, and persecution of its own people. However, Isaias Afwerki's administration rejected these reports as politically motivated lies. insisting that Eritrea's tough policies were necessary to maintain its sovereignty and develop the nation in its own way. Some loyalists argued that Western powers had a double standard and failed to appreciate Eritrea's attempts to be self-reliant and guard against extremism. But to many observers and many Eritreans abroad, the country had become a nation in a perpetual state of emergency, under siege by its own leaders. Back at Badme, this same dusty border between Eritrea and Ethiopia, it remained frozen for almost 20 years. No war, no peace, just barbed wire, bunkers, and silence. But then, in 2018, that silence shattered. It started with this guy, Abiy Ahmed, a young reformist politician who suddenly rose to become Ethiopia's prime minister. He was bold, charismatic, and unlike any Ethiopian leader Eritrea had dealt with before. And in his first speech, he did something quite unthinkable. He said Ethiopia would finally honor the Algiers Agreement. He acknowledged the border ruling. He was ready to give Badme back to Eritrea. The world watched stunned. This was the gesture Eritreans had waited nearly 20 years for. In Asmara, President Isaias Afwerki, initially skeptical, responded positively. He sent a delegation to Addis Ababa to explore peace. And in July 2018, for the first time in 2 decades, the leaders of Eritrea and Ethiopia embraced, literally, in front of cameras, in front of cheering crowds. For Eritreans, this was surreal. Phones started working again between the two countries for the first time in over a decade. Families separated for decades spoke through tears. Border crossings opened. Commercial flights resumed. There was dancing in the streets. Old enemies became brothers yet again. The international community lit up. Sanctions were lifted. Foreign diplomats rushed to Asmara. Aid started flowing, and Ethiopia's Abiy Ahmed even won the Nobel Peace Prize. This felt like a turning point. Eritrea, after years in the shadows, was stepping back into the light. But then, nothing really changed in Eritrea. The borders closed again within months. Political prisoners weren't released. The constitution wasn't revived. Indefinite national service continued. The press stayed silent. The internet remained locked down. The hope that came in 2018, so bright, so rare, well, it faded like a mist. In a twist of fate, the closing days of 2020 saw Eritrean soldiers once again crossing into Ethiopia. But this time, not as invaders of an enemy nation, but as allies in Ethiopia's internal war. A conflict had erupted in Ethiopia's Tigray region, led by the TPLF, the very group Eritrea had fought alongside in 1991, but later viewed as an arch-enemy. The Eritrean government, seeing an opportunity to eliminate the TPLF threat once and for all, joined forces with Ethiopia's federal army in this new war. Eritrean troops intervened across the border, and reports soon emerged of them committing grave abuses against Tigrayan civilians, looting, massacres, and systemic atrocities that drew international condemnation. Eritrea's regime, which had just shed the pariah label after the 2018 peace, found itself once more under global scrutiny and facing the prospect of renewed sanctions for its role in the Tigray war. Domestically, life in Eritrea remains tightly controlled. As of 2025, President Isaias Afwerki is one of the longest ruling heads of state in the world, in power for over 3 decades with no clear successor. The 1997 constitution is still unimplemented. The National Assembly has not met in years, and all decision-making rests in the hands of this man, President Isaias Afwerki, and his small circle of advisors. National service is still indefinite. Entire generations have come of age in uniforms. Some Eritreans have never signed a job contract in their life, never traveled freely, never voted. But the people have not given up. Whispers of resistance persist. Families are secretly sharing their stories. The repression is still strong, but so is the memory of the fighters who dug hospitals into mountains, the teachers who taught maths in caves, the mothers who marched 20 miles to deliver food to the front lines. Eritrea wasn't born from violence alone. It was built on vision, and that vision is still very much alive. In Asmara, school children still parade in bright colors. Patriotic songs echo through the streets. Portraits of fallen fighters are carried with reverence, because for all of its pain, Eritrea still means something real to people. It's more than a country. It's a promise, one that hasn't been kept but hasn't been abandoned either. And so the question remains, can Eritrea, this phoenix of the horn, can it rise again? Can it find a way to preserve its pride without crushing its own people? Can it escape the shadow of its own revolution? I don't know the answer to these questions, but I do know this. Eritrea's story isn't over, not by a long shot.